It's really nice to be here and to meet everyone. I wanted to, start by sharing where I am in the lands where I am. I'm presenting from the Dish with One Spoon Treaty area, so Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe territory. And I'm at McMaster University in my home here in Hamilton. And so just to pause for a moment and think about where you are and where you are in relation to the land, to the people, to the water. I wanted to just sort of start by saying we've been on this journey for a little while now, Janet and I together, thinking about these concepts of knowledge synthesis and how we can center Indigenous knowledges when we're engaged in knowledge synthesis activities and knowledge translation activities. But particularly challenging is the knowledge synthesis efforts. And so we're excited to be able to share sort of what we've learned over the past couple of years and where we think we're going with some of this learning. And also really excited to hear your perspectives and where you're at. So can you go to the next slide, please, Megan? So we wanted just a chance to introduce ourselves, not thinking that there would be a, so we would already had a 10-minute bio, but really just positioning ourselves. So I'm an associate professor at McMaster, and I'm a member of Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. And Janet, you want to introduce yourself and tell them about the Indigenous Peoples Working Group?
Sure. So yes, I self-identify as of European Canadian descent, or I'm Euro-Canadian as a citizen of what's called Canada, but I'm a settler scholar. So and that's how I position myself in relation to this work. And I'm also I'm an assistant professor at Queen's University, that's based in Kingston, Ontario. Jen, thanks so much for bringing up the land acknowledgement and giving us a pause there to reflect on where we're situated, because that's such a key part of all the work that we do. And I know that I can see that we have many people on the call that are from many different places. So I really appreciate everyone being here today. So we are co-leads of the SPOR Evidence Alliance Indigenous Peoples Working Group, or that's what we've called it. And our aim has really been to look at knowledge synthesis and understand how to do it in a way that promotes Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination, and in ways that are respectful and inclusive of Indigenous knowledges, because there are many different Indigenous knowledges in the land that's called Canada. And so we've really been working to reflect on this and understand how to think about knowledge synthesis. It's a big gap actually in the literature and how to consider this. Maybe we could just go to the next slide, which is the learning objectives for today. So today we actually wanted to talk with you, and the aim, of course, you bring your own objectives for learning to this, but for us, like when we were thinking about this, we considered the following learning objectives, which are to promote better understanding about Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination in the context of knowledge synthesis, to consider how to apply knowledge synthesis strategies that are respectful and inclusive of Indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing, doing, and being. And we also wanted to support thinking about how to ensure projects that may impact Indigenous peoples are designed in ways that promote ethical engagement of Indigenous people. So knowledge synthesis that is done by and with Indigenous people and communities. So those are our aims for today. I think we can go to the next slide now. Thanks, Megan. Great. So we have a poll here. We thought I really appreciate everybody being here today. I guess the one drawback is that there are so many people. It's really hard to have the kind of getting to know you discussion that would be so ideal and that we would welcome. So we thought we would try this poll. And if you could just let us know how you describe your level of experience in working directly with Indigenous communities or organizations, that would be great. So I'll just mute myself here while people go ahead and participate in that. And then I think, Megan, will you give us feedback on this? Like, let us know. Perfect.
Yes. And Janet, I just got a comment that someone found you a little bit quiet. So maybe you can just yell at us.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I'll just, Megan, prompt me if it's still a bit too quiet, okay? And if anyone's finding me quiet, please put it in the chat and I'll yell louder.
Sure. I mean, for me, it's okay, but I know everyone has different setups. Okay, so things are coming in. I'll let you know when we're getting close to the end here. It looks like lots of folks are participating. Okay. Okay, looks like most people have participated, so I'm just going to close it. Okay, so there you should be able to see everything.
Great. Thank you. Thanks everybody for sharing that. That's really helpful. And as you'll hear, I consider myself to be a learner in this work. We're definitely learning as we move forward. And so it's nice to hear about how you position yourselves, and I hope that we'll definitely be learning today, because I find I learn in every conversation. So thanks for sharing this. And Jen, I'm going to pass it on to you now to the next piece.
Thanks. It is helpful to know kind of where people are coming from, and you know, it does match sort of, I think, what we expected and what we prepared for, in terms of most people having, you know, some knowledge, or maybe not a lot of knowledge, but you know, fewer people having sort of the in-depth and extensive knowledge. So I wanted to start a little bit, because when we think about, even when we think about knowledge synthesis, so when we're talking about that, we're talking about things like reviewing literature. You know, these are the kind of typical things you think of: scoping reviews, you think of literature reviews, and ways of sort of synthesizing knowledge and evidence to make decisions or to guide decisions. But as we think about doing that in ways that center Indigenous knowledges, we have to disrupt how we think about it. And we have to disrupt even the purpose of it, and many aspects of the process. And to think about that from the perspective of Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination as a starting point. So, and this is sort of like, why would we do it differently? Why would we need to think about knowledge synthesis differently? And a starting point from this territory really is this idea of a two-row approach, a two-row wampum, which speaks to the concept of non-interference and making sure that Indigenous knowledges. So the idea with the two-row wampum, it actually is a way. The wampum is a way of articulating and displaying agreements. And this agreement that this particular wampum is articulating and showing is an agreement between early settlers to this territory and the Indigenous people, the Haudenosaunee people who were here. And so the idea with this two-row wampum is that all of the knowledge, the family structures, the governance structures, the ways of being, knowing, and doing for Indigenous people would travel in one of those rows. And all the knowledges and governance structures and ways of being, doing, and knowing, languages for the settlers would travel in the other row. And that these rows could travel in peace and friendship forever without interfering with each other. They could travel alongside each other without interference. And this fundamentally talks about Indigenous self-determination, these ideas of acknowledging Indigenous sovereignty. And so those are some of the earliest agreements. And then some of the more recent agreements around the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples also emphasizes Indigenous self-determination. And so we have to see this as an inherent right. Indigenous sovereignty is an inherent right that has to be acknowledged in all research endeavors, all policy endeavors, all really in anything that is going to impact Indigenous nations, peoples, communities, lands, has to involve and actually have free, prior, and informed consent, collective consent from Indigenous peoples. And this is a way of honoring original relationships. It's also a way of enacting reconciliation and by honoring that sovereignty. So, you know, if we reflect on it a little bit, what does it mean to live in Indigenous sovereignty? There's a lot of reflection that I think we all need to do in terms of what that means, but it does have direct implications on how we approach things like you know, a question that might come up related to you know, what does the literature say about such and such an Indigenous populations? We have to start thinking about, well, how do we do this in a way that honors Indigenous self-determination and sovereignty? So can you go to the next slide, please? Some of the things, so we talked about non-interference, self-determination. Some of the other things that we really need to be thinking about is that research by and for Indigenous peoples is ceremony that brings relationships together. We have to think about Indigenous methodologies that come from Indigenous research methodologies that build to relational accountability, that talk to that importance of interrelationships between our knowledges. That so in a sense, this sort of image of these trees that, you know, look very independent from the top, and then under the ground actually intersect with each other. They're intertwined. They help to hold each other up, but they are independent. And so just conceptually recognizing and understanding the distinctive nature of Indigenous knowledges at the same time as you know, endeavoring to ensure that these things can hold each other up, that we can find ways for them to intersect, different ways of knowing, being, and doing, so that Indigenous knowledges can be centered, honored, and help to drive the way we approach knowledge synthesis. So even in the way we approach the questions we ask, the way we gather literature, the way we review literature, the way that all of this happens has to honor Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing. Next slide, please. So some of what we've been really trying to focus in terms of centering Indigenous knowledges is when we're working on reviews, when we're working together with Indigenous partners, that we are, so that Indigenous peoples guide and shape knowledge synthesis processes focused on Indigenous topic and or Indigenous knowledges. So that is centered. And then we consult Western-oriented knowledge synthesis approaches as methods that help to go towards that overall goal of having Indigenous peoples guiding and shaping the processes. So that's kind of the positionality we've been taking in our work. I'll pass now to Janet for the next slide.
Thanks, Jen. So as Jen has mentioned, it's important to consider how to honor the original relationships that have been disrupted by settler colonialism, and we are all treaty people. And as researchers, we have a responsibility to consider how to do our work and how to function in academic systems and identify and take action on what it means to live with and support Indigenous sovereignty in our societies. So in our societies, the bias of colonial or Western-oriented and Western-constructed knowledge really dominates the conduct of research. And then the evidence that's derived from this standpoint reflects the structural racism that privileges knowledge derived from Western methodologies. And then this knowledge is used to inform the development of policies and processes that organize our health and social systems. So as a result, Western-oriented academic approaches fail to promote Indigenous perspectives and ways of knowing and policies that affect these communities. So for example, biomedical healthcare models reflect values, knowledge systems, research and care practices that tend to not meet the needs of Indigenous peoples. And Western-oriented academic research is also often focused on disparities and tends to be deficit-based. It seems to be the default approach taken by researchers quite often. And so these approaches tend to fail to consider and prioritize community needs. And then as well, many researchers are trained within a system that is dominated by Western-oriented perspectives that don't allow for or even recognize alternate ways of thinking or worldviews. So as researchers, we have a responsibility to consider the effects of our work on those in society. And there are no easy answers. Like, we're actually here today because we're talking about how we're working to figure this out in relation to knowledge synthesis. As a researcher who is not Indigenous, as a settler scholar, I consider myself to be in a journey of learning about how to be that researcher that is doing work that can better benefit people and their communities. So I really consider myself to be a humble learner in the work that I do. So next slide, please. So within mainstream academic and healthcare systems, the application of Western-derived knowledge alone is not reflected in the health and well-being of Indigenous people. And it's critical that Indigenous groups identify and develop knowledge that is useful, relevant, and applicable in Indigenous people's context. So it really needs to work, for people and communities. So to do this, researchers need to find ways to co-create knowledge with Indigenous partners. And to begin, there's a need for clarity about how to position the research endeavor. In Canada, there's some key documents that assert the need to address societal imbalances of power that undermine opportunities for Indigenous people's health and wellness. So Jen introduced the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples earlier in this presentation. And this is the document that sets out the rights of Indigenous people internationally and the minimum standards for survival, dignity, and wellness. There's also the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada report that provides history and ways to take action in a way relevant to Canada. And the purpose is to guide and inspire a process of reconciliation and renewed relationships that are based on mutual understanding and respect. And another key document is the report that came from the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. And these also have calls to action. And these reports are important because they stress why it's important to promote actions that don't risk perpetuating or reproducing existing colonial structures in health research. And as well, these documents explain why it's important to take action, and they can be really helpful for those of us in research to consider and act in ways that Indigenous people can identify as respectful and inclusive. Research needs to be done in ways that demonstrate understanding about what has happened in our past and to move towards a future that is better for everyone. Next slide, please, Megan. The research that is conducted with Indigenous people and communities must be conducted in ways that Indigenous people themselves identify as ethical and equitable. A principled approach to research upholds ethical guidance for research and can be described in 5 fundamental principles of research. So here in this slide, I'm introducing some fundamental principles for research conducted with Indigenous people, and they provide a basic framework for understanding and engaging in Indigenous research ethics. There's probably many people here have heard of the concept of the 4 R's of research: respect, reciprocity, relevance, and responsibility. And these were all developed by and for First Nations learners, and these have been adopted in research. And other Indigenous groups express similar concepts for fundamental principles. And these concepts are evident in guidelines that describe principled approaches to the conduct of research with Indigenous people. So respect is about research that respects cultural integrity, and it promotes respect for Indigenous people and their views of the world. Reciprocity is research that employs reciprocal relationships. So that's research that supports reciprocity, meaning respectful exchange of ideas and respect for all in the research relationship. And the ideas and the outcomes exchanged through the research process should bring about mutual benefits. And then there's relevance, and this is research that is relevant to Indigenous perspectives and experience. And so the research is identified as having relevance by Indigenous individuals and communities who will use or be impacted by the research. And then the fourth is responsibility. And this is research that supports Indigenous individuals or communities to exercise responsibility in the research and related processes. And the fifth R, relationships, was added a little later after the 4 Rs came out. And it emphasizes the importance of using approaches to research that prioritize relationships. So these are partnerships and research. And the use of principles facilitates processes of negotiation between community and academic research partners. And it can be used throughout the entire research study process, right from conceptualization through to the dissemination and application. And the use of principles is a way to emphasize collaboration, partnerships, and to address the power inequities in research processes. So when community and academic research partners use ethical principles to guide their research relationships, it helps to facilitate ethical processes of negotiation in the research study. And it produces research that everybody's going to be satisfied with and that can be taken up into practice. Next slide, please, Megan. So the slide here depicts research principles that were developed through a process of national consultation, and they're depicted in a document that may be familiar to some of you. It's called the CIHR Guidelines for Health Research Involving Aboriginal People, and that was in 2007 and 2010. These guidelines are what the Chapter 9 of the Tri-Council Policy Statement is based, and these guidelines have been acknowledged both nationally and internationally, not only for the rigor of their content, but also for the collaborative approach by which they're developed through community engagement and partnerships with Indigenous people all across the communities, and for supporting appropriate and relevant research to improve health. So I'm showing these principles to explain that there are some very concrete things that can be used by researchers, and that include guidelines and approaches to research. And keep in mind that society relies on research to develop and contribute knowledge that can be translated into improved health and wellness. And so when research is done in this community-centered way, it can identify, understand, and help to address health inequities, or those differences in health that are unnecessary, avoidable, and unjust. And when done appropriately, research can contribute to effective and sustainable health services and care products, and results in a more equitable and strengthened health system. So building equitable research partnerships is a really strong starting point for self-determination of Indigenous communities. The intent of showing that video wasn't to pitch the training resource, it was just as an illustration of the thinking around being on the learning journey, and thinking about how, as researchers, I mean, we're always learning as we do our research. I know it's a wonderful job if you're a curious person, because the learning is endless. But as far as working in partnerships with Indigenous communities, it's seeking out ways to educate yourself, and thinking of it as a learning journey is really key. So the video is actually just one example of many other resources that are available that can help you when you're thinking about how to do your research. So perfect. So you've got it on the perfect slide there. Thanks, Megan. So during our time together with Jen and myself with the SPOR Evidence Alliance, and it's working to sort of be the Indigenous Peoples Engagement Working Group lead, we've engaged in a variety of activities. So we've been working on a process to collaboratively develop guiding principles for the conduct of knowledge synthesis with Indigenous populations. And to do this, we've actually met with Indigenous stakeholders, so researchers, knowledge holders, and we've actually discussed their experiences with knowledge synthesis and reflected on approaches to a principled approach to research in the area of knowledge synthesis. So we ended up holding a series of meetings with a group of mostly Indigenous scholars and some of their non-Indigenous partners who are doing knowledge synthesis. And at those meetings, we reviewed the literature and discussed what a principled approach to knowledge synthesis looks like. We've also been building support opportunities for learning about knowledge synthesis with Indigenous people and communities. So for example, Jen, I have like the example of one of your students that you supported who actually is on this call, a master's thesis about traditional healers, roles and experiences in dementia care for Indigenous populations. So that was a really wonderful project that Jen supported in her role. And we've also presented to health researchers within the SPOR Evidence Alliance network on principled approaches to knowledge synthesis in our work. And in addition, we've provided support in the conduct of different knowledge synthesis projects. And of course, there are always learning opportunities, every single one. And one example is a review that is underway right now with Inuit partners about interventions to support Indigenous people who are making health decisions. Next slide, please. So we've been engaging in a process to collaboratively develop and use guiding principles for knowledge synthesis with Indigenous populations. And we actually ended up doing a workshop or had a gathering on knowledge synthesis and Indigenous research, because there's been very little attention to this topic. And there's a big gap in the literature about how to do knowledge synthesis. So we hosted a gathering last year over 2 days in February, and we were joined by 17 others who included elders, Indigenous and non-Indigenous scholars, and some graduate students. Our meetings focused on discussions about knowledge synthesis and how to work ethically with Indigenous knowledges and how to ensure that Indigenous community and leaders are centered in the knowledge synthesis process. And we confirmed there's a need to talk more about their approaches to knowledge synthesis and determined that there are many others who are interested in this topic. So we've continued working with this group that gathered. And one of the outcomes are that we have produced some podcasts. And these are interviews with different members of that group, sharing their views on different aspects of knowledge synthesis and their conduct. And these podcasts will be open access and shared widely. Next slide, please. So we have a few more products that will be available aside from the podcast series. There's a webinar that will be offered through the SPOR Evidence Alliance group a little later this spring, and some reports. So a final report summarizing our learning and proposing next steps for work about knowledge synthesis with Indigenous people and communities. Jen, I'll pass it back to you now.
Thank you. And one of the things I wanted to highlight, I think, about that, so you can go to the next slide, is that we really, like when we started, we had those workshops and we were working together with other people to think about these important questions. The views are, so we were really hoping maybe at the end of that workshop, we would end up with a set of principles or some guidance for people who are embarking on an evidence synthesis kind of project, a knowledge synthesis project. What are the sort of things you need to be considering, principles? And we were in that state of there's so many ideas, new ways of thinking about it. And we were in really, we found ourselves in those 2 workshop days in this period of divergent thinking. Like we were still having new ideas, new perspectives and things like that. So that's why we decided, rather than trying to bundle all of those things and say, okay, here's how you do it, we didn't feel like as a community we were ready to do that, which is why we decided to go the podcast route, so that we had a student who did interviews with different Indigenous community members and scholars and elders to think about how to give their perspectives, so that we can listen to each other in sort of an in-depth way as we collectively as a community start to think about how to come out the other side with some, some convergent thinking. And so that's kind of where we're at. Like, I wanted to kind of give that state of things. We're in this broad open space where there's still lots to be discussed and discovered. But, you know, what we do know is that we need to be honoring Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination and research, and that includes knowledge synthesis. What that actually looks like in terms of making sure that you honor the original owners, ownership of a nation who publishes research from their nation and then ends up in a knowledge synthesis. How does that, how do we make sure we're honoring that self-determination and sovereignty of the original owners of that research? Those are questions we still have, things we're still thinking about. But what we want to communicate is that it is important, that what we know is that it's important to be thinking about sovereignty and self-determination. And that also applies to how the questions come, what we do with those questions, and how we approach the process of doing knowledge synthesis. The second thing is building our understanding about knowledge synthesis in ways that respect and include Indigenous knowledges. So I think Home may have just had to say goodbye. He's saying Bamapi, so he's heading out, but he's the student, the master's student that Janet was referring to. What you know, for example, what Home did was to gather a group of elders that he had worked with along the way in his journey to present to them the sort of themes that came from his scoping review and really like explore them from their perspectives, and that so their knowledge was centered in his final work. And they were centered along because he was working alongside with the guidance of elders along the way. So we don't know exactly how to do that. We can't say here's exactly the way or even the ways that this should happen, but what we do know is that we need to respect and include Indigenous knowledges. And so that's another thing to reflect on. And then the last thing is that we really need to make sure that we're taking action on Indigenous people's engagement in knowledge synthesis and related activities, so that, you know, we're doing things in ways that that are not about Indigenous peoples, but that researchers are working with Indigenous peoples. Can you go to the next slide? So we would love to hear from you. We know that you probably have experiences and learning and questions, and we may or may not have answers to, but really would love to understand your experiences with engaging Indigenous partners in knowledge synthesis. What are your thoughts on some of the ways that we can honor Indigenous ownership of the original studies in a knowledge synthesis? These are some of the questions that we like to ask people because we're still trying to learn. Like I said, we're in this wide open space, like you can see here, where there's lots of different, there's land, there's water, there's roads, there's lots of different things in this image, and there's still lots of different things in the path forward. And we're still in a learning, on that learning journey. So I just want to say thank you, and maybe these questions can guide our discussion, and maybe they're, you know, you can contact us later with some of your thoughts, but we wanted to leave you with those. And the next slide is just a thank you.
Oh.
I think that's Janet's dog. Is it your dog, Janet? Yeah.
Very nice. All right, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen so I have a better view of everyone. So we're going to open it up to questions, and my apologies for the video. We did test it, but despite that, it decided to misbehave. So I am sorry about that. We can certainly send everyone the link so they can view it a little more smoothly. Yeah, so any questions that people are thinking about? Was there any part that you wanted to expand on while we're letting people think a little bit?
I think we do have a question.
Oh, is there? I'm sorry.
So Jenny Brunton has.
Oh, I wasn't. Thank you, Ginny.
Hi, Janet and Jennifer. Thank you so much for your presentation. It's really timely for me because I'm working on a proposal for Indigenous engagement in a systematic review that I'm looking at some data that I gathered around home birth recently. And you know, it's not my knowledge. I recognize that it's not my knowledge to interpret. So I need some help with it. And really, it makes me think about a couple of different things, you know, in terms of engaging a community. You know, I'm situated with the Mississaugas of Scugog Island, and perhaps home birth isn't the most important topic for them, you know, in thinking about kind of connecting with a local community. So it makes me wonder about how do I find out where I can look for the appropriate Indigenous community to advise on a research topic that they may be interested in. And then secondly, I'm thinking about what's appropriate when we do the actual systematic review process. So we've got critical appraisal tools. So I'm doing qualitative evidence synthesis of research on Indigenous people's views about home birth. And there are critical appraisal tools for assessing that, but they may have a very Western influence, a very Western way of looking at what constitutes good research. So I'm just kind of wondering if methodologically there's been work to look at that. Thank you.
Janet, go ahead. I know you have some things to say about that.
Well, I do. Well, I'll start, but Jen, I know you'll bring something really important to that too. Like, first of all, Jamie, amazing, like so thoughtful, and you're just way ahead of everything here because you've already been thinking about this and considering this, and the way you gathered the data has made it possible for you to seek engagement or partnerships, and I think that's marvelous. I found you brought up a question like how do you engage with a community partner in like a knowledge synthesis? And there has been some work done in the area of integrated knowledge translation that has found that integrated knowledge translation aligns really nicely with Indigenous knowledge translation. And so you're probably aware, because this is KT Canada, so everyone here is probably aware of what integrated knowledge translation is.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, like as a non-Indigenous researcher, I find that's an approach that is really supportive of the kinds of partnerships and shared governance. It's a really good strategy to employ to support Indigenous sovereignty. So it's not enough. Like, I mean, you need to bring in guidelines or guidance, and often communities will have guidelines or guidance like that are specific to the area. If not, then there are things like the CIHR guidelines that I referenced earlier. Those are something that they're used internationally, and so there are other guidelines that you can use that if the community partner likes them. So there are ways to structure this. Gosh, you said so much. And then the critical appraisal, absolutely. And someone put a note about critical appraisal, and yes, there are tools out there. One of them that I like, and actually there's another one that I was just going to start looking up for you, but one that I really like was developed at Well Living House with a very, probably you've heard of Dr. Janet Smiley, quite an amazing Indigenous scholar, like researcher.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a marvelous critical appraisal tool there that I like to use. In addition to, like, I sort of use a few different things, but I think that's critical. There's also Skipper, one of the SPOR units out west in Saskatchewan. They have something called the ERLIT, and there might be someone on the call here who actually, I think I saw someone's name who actually helped develop that, and I think that's a marvelous tool to assess engagement. So there are things out there, and they're always coming out, and they're really good. So if we can be helpful in any way, like, please send a message. I'd be happy to share anything. Jen, is it okay to pass it over to you? Like, do you have, I know there's some questions about like how to seek out engagement or partnership, and there's a lot.
Yeah, and I think, thanks, Janet. And I agree on the critical appraisal / quality assessment, making sure that at a minimum, you're also like the quality of an Indigenous study that's being included in you need to be assessing the degree of engagement that they have, like that each individual study has. That's a sort of a minimum quality criteria. So those sort of like how was the study designed and developed and reported, and is there meaningful involvement of Indigenous people in the research? So that's, and perspectives. So that's that as in terms of assessing the quality, minimally it needs to do that. In terms of like partnerships, like that's a big question, right? So in a sense, like the first question I asked in my head when you asked your question was, well, why did you do it? Like, where did the question come from? So who were you working with, or what were you doing that made you decide to ask that question? Because that might direct you to sort of the decisions around involving people, or was it just sort of you musing and deciding to ask the question? Because usually the question will come together, like should probably right from the idea of doing the project happens in partnership. But if not, then really like I think it's harder to do once you've started, right? Like I think it's harder to do once you've started to sort of say, okay, I did all this work, can you come together to sort of see what you think of it? Is different than sort of starting from the beginning and saying, I am wondering about this, what are you wondering about, and can we put together a question for a systematic review that might answer those questions that we collectively have that might help you, like in centering Indigenous engagement and perspectives and self-determination. It should happen at the start, but I get that it happens at the end a lot of times. And in that case also, like it might not be, when we say community, it might not be an individual First Nation community. It might be that, you know, you would engage with Indigenous midwives, you know, or because you're talking about home births, you might be engaging with Indigenous nurses, or, you know, like there are other organizations and structures that you could be engaging with to think about the importance of those questions. So I guess it's, yeah, I think that there's lots to think about and reflect on in that question about how do you start in engagement and at what point. And my advice is start from the beginning and just seek out those who have similar questions, I guess, or who want to answer that question together. Is that helpful, Ginny?
Okay.
Oh gosh, thank you. It is. I could talk all afternoon about this, but I'll email you separately outside if you don't mind. Just so fantastic to have made this connection.
Excellent. Okay, I'm just going to go to a couple questions that are in the chat. So first one is from Robin. And Robin says, I'm thinking about the critical appraisal quality assessment process that is part of some KS projects. And I wonder if the R's that you mentioned could be integrated into how we look at the primary literature that's included in the review or synthesis.
Thanks for that question, and it's such a good one. And I've put a few things in the a few examples of critical appraisal tools that have been developed, because you're right, like it's such an important piece, because the lack of attention to Indigenous values in primary research can be mirrored in knowledge synthesis, and then you end up with evidence that isn't really reflecting what is really important to people. And Ginny, it's really great. You also put in the chat that you've used one of those critical appraisal tools, which is great. And could you tell us, like, how was your experience with that, Ginny? Is that okay to put you on the spot with that?
I just had a look at the reference more closely and I got too excited. We used, so we did a scoping review that looked at the extent of integrating Indigenous knowledges in primary healthcare research. And, you know, fingers crossed that's going to be published very soon. But we use the Harfield framework that looks at different dimensions of integration of Indigenous involvement as a way of looking at the extent of community engagement that was taking place in primary healthcare strategies to incorporate Indigenous knowledges into primary healthcare. Does that make sense?
It does, that's amazing.
I didn't know that they had actually also published a critical appraisal tool, so I'm really excited to have a closer look at this for the home birth review. I'm qualitative evidence synthesis that I'm trying to get funding for.
Amazing. Yeah, and then there's also I shared another link to the Well Living House citation as well, which I quite like as well. And Jen, I don't know if you have any thoughts on critical appraisal tools or anything you want to add to that.
No, that's great, Janet. Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah, it's nice. It's a really active area right now. I feel like it's active because there's been these things that have come out more recently. And honestly, I just think why do we not have these, you know, for in other areas, you know, like they're marvelous. Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks. Yeah, go ahead, Ginny. Go ahead and ask another question.
Thank you. If the audience will humor me asking one other question. So one of the things, so integrated knowledge translation, I'm well aware of that, and thinking about the suitability of that for working with Indigenous communities to do systematic reviews, to do knowledge synthesis. And one of the challenges is around actually trying to evaluate that partnership, that knowledge, integrated knowledge translation. And so I wondered if you could speak a little bit about, you know, where the state of the research is around evaluating Indigenous engagement or reflecting on Indigenous engagement in an integrated knowledge translation kind of way. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to jump into this and then Jen, pass it to you. And just to say, so I use integrated knowledge translation with the groups that are not Indigenous. Well, I'm on a few different research teams and one of them isn't Indigenous, and we've developed some evaluation, and we're actually in the process of assessing how that evaluation went, because you're right, there's a big gap in the literature about how to assess integrated knowledge translation, like how do we evaluate what the experience was like for people in it. So it's a huge gap just in general for general populations. For partnerships with Indigenous partners, so far, what we've used are principles that resonate with Indigenous partners. So that's how we've assessed our working together. As far as the partnerships go, like have we achieved, have we met the sort of the hopes, like the values, and held those values up in our research together, values that are important to Indigenous partners. And so that's what we've used. To me, that's a reflection of the success of the integrated knowledge translation or the collaborative relationship. Jen, do you have anything? Like, I don't know how you.
Only just to say, I would, in the projects that have sort of really required an evaluation of how the engagement has gone, it's very challenging because it assumes that there's sort of like researchers engaging community, and then that's like, how well did you do at that? When really it should be a co-developed, how well are we working together kind of question. So I have struggled with it and have had to sort of, in a sense, reframe it for the work that we do to sort of say, this is how our relationship works. And so we are going to collaboratively tell the story of how our collaboration works. So really, like, any indicators of that you would use in an evaluation of how well the community engagement need to be co-developed. And it is a whole, it's almost like a whole project within a project, because that also needs to be co-developed.
Yeah, I think some of these guidelines, so for instance, there is a National Inuit Research Strategy. That's a really nice, like, so I take things that are meaningful to the community and use those to assess our work. And as Jen was saying, you know, it's really what is meaningful to the partners. So if there are guidelines that are meaningful to partners and you can frame that up as a way to have the discussion or reflect what happened, that's wonderful. Or perhaps it's, you know, a more storied approach. But yeah, Ginny, as you put in the chat, it's really a relational assessment. So we'll get there eventually, I think. As researchers, we'll figure it out.
Okay, there's 2 more questions, so we'll see if we can get to at least one before we wrap up. So Alex had a question in the chat. She said, I'm wondering how you have engaged expert health science librarians who are an integral part of the KS team, given their expertise in data collection and searching. So how you've engaged them in the workshops and the discussions to date, or if you plan to in the future. And then she said, i.e. the role of the librarian working with the Indigenous researchers and community for data collection. What should KS librarians be doing in their searching?
Janet, do you want to go ahead? I can say very quickly that, of course, they're still valued members of the team. We haven't really specifically done any work to engage health science or librarians specifically, but they always are part of these teams. I think some of the messages is really just to make sure that the diversity of Indigenous populations and the ways that Indigenous Indigenous authors might appear, like how do we like translate that prioritizing and centering Indigenous knowledge? That person is very key to that. So you know, I recently saw a publication, and I'll try and find it here on the side, on prioritizing Indigenous authors in literature reviews, and how to find Indigenous authors. So I think there's lots of work to do in this space. And I don't know, Janet, if you have other thoughts.
No, just like what a great idea. So yeah, thank you for that. And I've written it in here. I actually don't know of any Indigenous librarian scientists, and so I'm sure there must be someone out there, but I would love to meet them and to learn from them too. And I would just say I am a big fan of librarian scientists. I don't do anything in the area of knowledge synthesis without working closely with them. And I've just been so impressed with the librarian scientists that I've had the opportunity to work with. They're really leaders in this thinking. So thank you for that comment.